Um, Last week, we were talking about replacement theology and how it's affected our biblical thinking. We talked about last week how non-Jews can develop a wrong understanding, and I talked about how the serpent was really a crocodile, and I talked about how God, when he hardened Pharaoh's heart, he actually strengthened Pharaoh's heart. We talked about the rooster crowing, which never happened. It was a priest who had the title of rooster. We talked about the woman at the well, who everyone thought was horrible, but actually was one of the holiest women in the whole New Testament. And then we talked about blind Bartimaeus, how he was the only one who could actually see. Today we're going to talk about some other missed connections. I have 3 missed connections, but it's because of our lack of the Hebrew culture. So, how many of you have ever heard of the Amida? Who has never heard of the Amida? Wow. Okay. Those of you that aren't familiar are going to be blown away. The Amida, and we have the Amida in folders we can make available to everyone for free. This is 18 blessings. It's a prayer that is said 3 times a day. But guess what? It was written in 450 BC. And it was written by Ezra, Nehemiah, at the rebuilding of the temple when they rebuilt it. And 3 times a day at the hours of prayer, which is 9 in the morning, the time of the morning sacrifice, noon, and then 3 in the evening, the time of the evening sacrifice. So 3 times a day they would say this prayer. But guess what? That means Jesus said this prayer 3 times a day his entire life. To think we are holding right here a prayer that is over 2,000 years old, that Jesus prayed this prayer 3 times every day. It's a pretty cool prayer. So I'm going to talk about it. Now, the Amida is known as the standing prayer. So guess what you do when you say this prayer? You guys are good. Okay. Now, there's a mistranslation in every English Bible. Again, it's in Acts chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Peter and John went up together into the temple at the hour of prayer." Wrong translation. It's at the hour of the prayer, and this is the prayer that they said. And then it says, being the what hour? 9th hour. That's 3 in the afternoon, time of the evening sacrifice. So they were going up at the very time all of Israel is standing, wanting to say the standing prayer. Now, this prayer, like I said, is over 2,400 years old. All right? And there's 18 blessings in it. And so you have to realize that this prayer was being said 3 times a day, almost 500 years before Jesus was even born. This is entrenched in the Jewish thinking. Well, guess what? Here in the book of Acts, let's look at a proper translation now in chapter 3, verse 1 through 2. Now Peter and John went up together into the temple at the hour of the prayer. This is the prayer. And it says, there was a certain man who was lame from his mother's womb. Here is a man who's never been able to stand for the standing prayer. But we miss that whole connection if we don't know it's the standing prayer, that they're laying this man down who's never been able to stand. And look at this. It says, after being the 9th hour, and there was a certain man lame from his mother's womb. This is for his entire life he was carried, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, to ask alms of those that entered the temple. That's the eastern gate. Now, guess what? Look at Acts 4:22. This man was over 40 years old on whom this miracle of healing was shown. Do you know what that means? This man was older than Jesus. Every time Jesus went through the eastern gate, he looked at that guy and he waved and never healed him. He's over 40 years old. Jesus died around 33. Jesus never healed this guy. He was waiting for him to be healed at the time of the evening prayer during the Feast of Shavuot. Now watch this. It says he was laid daily at the gate. Every day for 40 years, he's been praying 3 times a day. One of the prayers is for healing. We're going to take a look at it here in a minute. Here's the prayer for healing. I have it for you guys. It's from here, but I have it on your notes. Here's what this lame man prayed every day for 40 years. Heal us, O Lord, and we will be healed. Save us, and we will be saved. You are our praise. O grant a perfect healing to all of our ailments. For you, Almighty King, are a faithful and merciful healer. Blessed are you, O Lord, the healer of the sick of his people, Israel. That's what this guy prayed 3 times a day for 40 years. And Jesus walks by him and waves and never heals him. Wow. Now let's look at Acts 3, 6 through 9. This man has always been wanting to stand for the standing prayer. What does Peter say? Silver and gold, I don't have any, but what I do have, I'll give you. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach of Nazareth, rise up and walk. And he took him by the right hand, lifted him up, and immediately his feet and ankle bones received strength. And leaping up, what did he do? Stood. He stood for the standing prayer. But Christians have no idea that the standing prayer is when he stood, and that's what the Lord was trying to emphasize. And then he walked, and he entered with them into the temple, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God. And so God was waiting for all the Jews to be gathered in the temple. So at the very moment of the Amida, while all of Israel is praising God, to heal this man. I think this is amazing. And if any of you want a copy of this, we've got a copy of this prayer that's 2,000 years old. But there's another prayer in here that is completely mind-blowing to me. Are you ready? Look at this. You remember when Yeshua died, and then he was buried for 3 whole days, right? Yes, every day, what the disciples did 3 times a day. They prayed the standing prayer. Look at one of the prayers. It's the second prayer. It's called the God of nature. Now imagine this is the very prayer they prayed in the upper room 3 times a day for 3 days while, they're worried. And how many of you know they didn't want Jesus to die? Well, look at what they're praying. The God of nature. You, O Lord, are mighty forever. You revive the dead. So I can just see them, raise Yeshua, raise Yeshua. But they're praying this 3 times a day for over 500 years before this event even. You sustain the living with loving kindness. You revive the dead with great mercy. You support the falling, heal the sick. You set free the bound and keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. Who is like you, O doer of mighty acts? Who resembles you, a king who puts to death and restores to life and causes salvation to flourish, and you are certain to revive the dead? Blessed are you, O Lord, who revives the dead. You think they were praying that very fervently those 3 days he was in the earth? Well, get a load of this. What is Jesus' real name was Yeshua. What is the Hebrew translation Yeshua into English supposed to be? Salvation. And the word to flourish, it talks about Adam's rod that was dead, that blossomed and budded and produced almonds. Okay, that means to flourish, to resurrect. In this very prayer, if you look toward the bottom, it says, O doer of mighty acts, who resembles you, a king who puts to death, restores to life, and causes Yeshua to resurrect. That's what they're saying in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for salvation is Yeshua. And the word flourish could be to resurrect. So 3 times a day for 3 days, they're praying this prayer that you cause Yeshua to resurrect. Can you imagine? And I believe it was at that very time, all of a sudden he appears in their midst. At the time of the evening sacrifice, 3 in the afternoon. I mean, if you don't know the Amida, you miss all the connections back that he's making. Are you ready for more? Yeah, this is the man. You can just see him asking for alms. And then those 3 days, He's in the grave, and they're praying, resurrect, resurrect. And at that very moment, all of a sudden, he resurrects, and he's standing right there in their midst. That is just crazy. Okay, here is another one. Let me see. Oh, yeah, I have John 20:19. Look at this. On the same first day of the week, when? At evening time. When is evening? 3 p.m. It says, after the doors had been locked shut where the disciples were staying because they were afraid of some of the authorities of the people of Yehuda, Yeshua came, and what did he do? He stood. He stood at the time of the standing prayer. That's when he appears to them, at the time of the evening sacrifice. And he said, chill. So here we have the very prayer that Yeshua said 3 times a day, and what they were actually praying in the upper room. Isn't that just incredible? This is the prayer. So we have a bunch of these. We can give them to you for those who want them. Okay, now I'm going to tell you another story so you can draw some really phenomenal connections. In Mark chapter 3, this is the story of the man with the withered hand. And it says, Jesus entered into the synagogue, and there was a man there who had a withered hand. And now everybody's watching Yeshua, whether he would heal him. How horrible to heal somebody on a Sabbath day. How cruel can you be? Okay, this is so they could accuse him. And Yeshua said to the man who had the withered hand, stand forth. And then Yeshua turns to the scribes and the Pharisees and says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? It says they held their peace. Why did they hold their peace? Because they were clueless. He caught them in a trap. They don't know how to respond. And when he looked around them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it out. And his hand was restored as the other. And then the Pharisees went forth, took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. What are your thoughts when you read this story? What comes to your mind? Jealousy? I mean, don't you think it's a little over the top to want to kill him? I mean, he healed the guy. I mean, you might be disgruntled, but why did they want to kill him? It's because of the story behind the story you don't know. Now, one of the ways to study the Torah, and this is one of the things I've learned, and there's a book called How to Study the Torah, and it tells you all the different ways that the Torah can be studied, and I'll be going over that this week and next week. But one of the things you do is look for phrases that repeat. Look for phrases that repeat. And that connects them together. That's one way. Okay. On first reading this thing, you might think it sounds perfectly straightforward. Jesus works a miracle on the Sabbath. Okay. The Jews thought it was against the law to heal on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees want to kill him. Now, if we take this account simply as being an account of a miracle, the reaction of the Pharisees is really over the top. Why would they want to kill him? Okay, but an even stranger view, which many Christians take, is, well, therefore Jesus did away with the Sabbath because he healed on the Sabbath. That's what some say. Or he did away with the law, or they say the Jews are evil. But none of that is true. Here it is, a Sabbath day. So let's think about it for a minute. What do they do on the Sabbath? They study the Torah. That's what the Jews have always done. And one of the things, how many of you know Yeshua loved to tell stories? And most of the Old Testament is stories. God knows how to relate to us through stories. And so every Sabbath, they would reenact Moses, one of the stories, to bring the Torah to life. Okay? It's not just head knowledge, it's practical knowledge. So what Yeshua is doing, he says, okay, let's go back to Moses. Let's put before you this choice. There's a blessing if you obey and a curse if you disobey. We know obeying means to pursue life, and disobeying means to pursue death. Let's look at Deuteronomy 11, 26 through 28. God says, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if you obey the commandments, which I command you this day, and a curse if you don't obey the commandments of the Lord your God. This is the same thing Moses says very close to the end of his life in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15 through 18. He says, see, I've set before you this day life and good, death and evil. And this is what Yeshua is saying to the scribes and the Pharisees in the temple at this time. On the Sabbath, is it better to do good or evil? Life or death? This is what he's setting before them. Now, look at Deuteronomy. It says that you may live. And then it says, if your heart turn away so you won't hear, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I denounce you to this day that you will surely perish. Okay, so why was the Sabbath created? Why was it created? It was created for mankind, yes, but it was so we would work? No, it was created so we could, but not only that, it's to have fellowship with the Father. It's not rest apart from him. It's to rest with him. Okay, so now Yeshua turns to the Pharisees and does to them what they thought they had done to him. He puts them on the spot. They were trying to get him in some kind of a Moses trap. But in the book of Deuteronomy, the texts are central to the Jewish people. They know the book of Deuteronomy. That's where the Shema is, for heaven's sake. And there are several key moments where Moses gets everybody present to assent to what he's teaching to them. Well, two of these are very well-known passages. Deuteronomy 11, which repeats the Shema. Look at this one, Deuteronomy 11, 1 through 4. He says, therefore, you will love the Lord your God, keep his charge and his statutes and his judgments and his commandments always, and know you this day, for I speak not with your children which have not known these things, or which have not seen the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and what else? His stretched out arm, his miracles, his acts that he did in the middle of Egypt even, to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all this land. And what he did to the army of Egypt, to their horses and chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea overflow them when they pursued after you, and how the Lord has destroyed them to this day. Now, how many of you know every year when the Jews do Passover, they read the story of Egypt and Pharaoh and them leaving, crossing the Red Sea? That's what the whole Passover Seder is about, that they've been doing every year. Now, here we go. Are you ready? We're going to go through these kind of fast. Exodus 9:22. What do they read every Passover? The Lord said to Moses to do what? Stretch forth your hand toward heaven that there may be hail. Exodus 10:12. And the Lord said to Moses what? Okay, we'll try it one more time. Exodus 10:21. And the Lord said to Moses what? All right, we're getting it. And there was darkness repeatedly. Now look at Exodus 14:15 through 17. And the Lord said to Moses, why are you whining to me? Speak to the children of Israel that they go forward, lift up your rod and do what? Stretch out your hand. And then he says, I will harden the hearts of all the Egyptians, and they'll follow them, and I'll give me honor on Pharaoh and all of his host and his chariots and his horsemen. Now let's go to the next verse in 21 of Exodus 14. So what did Moses do? Stretched out his hand over the sea. Okay, can you get the idea? All right. Now, let's look at Exodus 14, 26 and 27. And the Lord said to Moses, what? Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come again on the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on the horsemen. And so what did Moses do? Stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned, and all the Egyptians fled, and all the Egyptians died. Every Jew knows these verses. They have it memorized. It's been 1,500 years, for heaven's sake, since this event happened for them. Well, guess what? That happened on a Sabbath. It was on a Sabbath that they left Egypt. And the first Passover is Nisan 14. Nisan 15, the first day of unleavened bread, is a Sabbath. That's when they packed up their bags and they traveled far more than a Sabbath day journey. So what is Yeshua telling them? Moses allowed them to pick up their bags and get the heck out of Egypt. And 7 days later, on another Sabbath, the last day of the Feast of Leavened Bread, is when all of the Red Sea covers them. So he's saying, look, you guys, you're trying to trap me with Moses. Moses is the one who said you could travel on the Sabbath and had a great victory. And he said, Moses is the one who said you could cross the Red Sea on the Sabbath. So he's saying, why are you telling me that I can't heal one person on the Sabbath? He wasn't doing away with the Sabbath. He was reinforcing it because they didn't understand the Sabbath. That's why I've said earlier, the priests who's supposed to know me don't even know my law. They were clueless. Okay. Now, I just got done reading how God said he would harden the hearts of all the Egyptians, right? Okay. Now, Yeshua has them in a quandary because that's why they shut up. They don't know how to respond. They know exactly what he's saying. For them, Moses was someone who they might use against Jesus, but now he's offered them the real Moses. Okay? Insinuating that the real Moses is totally against their imagined Moses in a way that's perfectly clear to them. The problem is, those Jews were following a replacement theology that imagined a Moses of their own liking. There was replacement theology back then. They were thinking of God not as he really is. They were presenting God as some harsh. I was raised Catholic, and I always saw God as throwing lightning bolts at the people down below. He was out to get us. But that's not who God is. And so replacement theology is even within the Jewish people. They're trying to, and just like we do, we try to create God in our image rather than realizing we're created in his image. But look at this. Yeshua was grieved because of the hardness of their heart. So when we read these verses, we need to connect it back to the original story. So what is happening? The man with the withered hand becomes Moses, and Yeshua tells him to do what? Stretch forth your hand. And then he's angry because of the hardness of their heart. Yeshua becomes Yahweh, God, who is telling the withered man. So they're totally upset at Yeshua because he's taking on the role of God, telling the man with the withered hand that you're Moses and stretch forth your hand, and they become the hard-hearted Egyptians who don't want him healed. But unless you understand the connections of the phrases, you miss the whole connection of what's really going on and why they wanted to kill him. Isn't that fascinating? So now Yahweh's evil because Yahweh freed everybody on the Sabbath? You can see how they caught him in a total trap, but it's because of their imagination of a different Moses than the real Moses. And that's what many Christians also do today. But what's amazing, according to forever, the leaving Egypt happened on the first day of unleavened bread. That's a Sabbath. The crossing of the Red Sea happened on the seventh day of unleavened bread, which is a Sabbath. So a lot of it is just a misunderstanding. Okay, so now, again, the question is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? God says, I do both. I save you and I destroy them. They're both good. But my question is, what do you choose? Do we want to be a hard-hearted Egyptian? Or do we want to be a God-fearing believer? Okay, so that brings me to another story. But you can see how if you know that when you're reading the Gospels, everything comes to life. It's a whole different idea when you connect the dots. This is one of my other absolutely favorite stories. Okay, you can see the map here. You can see the Sea of Galilee. You can see Capernaum up at the top. And then I want you to look toward the bottom where these two red stars are. You see Mount Moreh. Now, Moreh in the Hebrew means teacher. Okay, Yeshua was the teacher, the Moreh. But you see Shunem right there? Okay, up here's Capernaum. And then here's Nain. You notice Nain is right next to Shunem? Two miracles occurred in the Bible. One of them happened in Shunem. The other one happened in Nain. As we read the story, we're going to find out Yeshua was in Capernaum, and then he heads down to Nain. But before we do that, we're going to go and connect the dot to something in the Tanakh. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. It fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem. So now you know where Shunem is, and that's where Elisha went, where was a great woman, and she constrained Elisha to eat bread. And so it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat bread. Well, what happens in the story in verse 14 through 17, Gehazi, who was Elisha's servant, answered and said to Elisha, she has no child. Her husband is old. And so Elisha said, well, call her. And when he had called her, she stood at the door, and he said, about this season, according to the time of life, you're going to have a son. And she said, no way, my Lord, you man of God, don't you lie to me. Okay. And the woman ended up conceiving and bare a son at that season that Elisha said unto her, according to the time of life. Now, one thing you may not have heard, but I believe in Jewish history, this was Jonah. It's who she gave birth to. It was Jonah. But anyway, aside from that, that happened in Shunem. Well, guess what? How many of you know little towns know everything that goes on? All right. Let's go to Luke 7, 1 and 2. Yeshua had finished speaking in the hearing of all the people. He entered into where? Capernaum. And we're going to go there in a few months. We're going to be there. A certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and at the point of death. Everyone know that story, right? Well, look at this. In Luke 7, 11, and 12. It came to pass the day after, he went into a city called Nain. Okay, now we know in Shunem, miracle happened with Elijah and a child was born. Now let's look what happens. He went into the city called Nain, and how many of his disciples went with him? Many. Could have been 1,000 or something. I mean, many of his disciples were following him. It says went with him and much people. So we're talking about a lot. And when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man being carried out, the only son of his mother. Remember in the story in Elisha, the kid ends up dying and Elisha has to go back and resurrect him back to life, laying on him 3 times. Remember that? So here a child was raised from the dead in Shunem. Well, now here in Nain, the same thing. A son, the only one of his mother, is dead and being carried out. And it says she was a widow. And how many people was with her? Much people were with her. Okay, so now here comes the story. How many of you, when you grew up, I don't know how it is in other nations. We have many nations right here in the house. But how many of you, whenever a funeral was going by, everyone's car stopped? Every car stopped, let the funeral procession go by. That was protocol, right? That comes from Judaism of 2,000 years ago. Whenever a funeral procession was taking place, the women would always be in the front, okay? And then you would have the men and the children, and at the very end was the funeral bier carrying the dead person, and they're leaving the gate of the city because you can't have dead people in the city. The cemetery was always outside of the city limits, and they would carry. And back then what would happen, whenever people were coming into a town, if there was a funeral procession going on, they would all stop, and they wouldn't enter the town, walking until the funeral procession went by. So that was history. Okay, well, here's the thing. The Jews were always into protocol. I mean, that's why they make good lawyers. They were always into what's right. Well, guess what? The Jews asked, oh my goodness, what do we do if there's a funeral procession and all of a sudden on the street comes a wedding procession? Who's supposed to stop? This happens. And they decided the wedding procession has the priority because it's about life and not death. And then they said, oh my goodness, what happens if there's a wedding procession and a funeral procession and a procession of the King of Israel? Who has to stop? Okay, so here we go. Here comes the funeral procession. Here comes the wedding procession. The funeral procession has to stop. Here comes the king of Israel. The wedding procession has to stop because the king of Israel always has the priority. Now think about this for a minute when you go back to the story. Here we have many people, it says, that are coming into the city with Yeshua. A gate is a narrow gate of the city. And many people are leaving the city with the funeral procession. There's this big clash of customs. Who is going to stop? Is the wedding procession supposed to stop? Is the Yeshua? Do they recognize him as the king of Israel? Are they going to stop? Is Yeshua going to break protocol and say, let the funeral procession go, I'm backing off? Or is he going to say, I'm the king of Israel and you guys stop? See, you don't see that unless you know the culture. You don't realize that when it says many people were with him and many people are leaving the city and it's all at the same time, you don't make these connections. Well, listen to Luke 7:13 and 14. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and those that bore him, what did they do? The whole procession stops for the king of Israel. This is a verse that proves Yeshua in another, according to the culture and custom, is the king of Israel. And so he keeps moving from the beginning of the funeral procession all the way to the end, and everyone is standing still for him. And then what does he do? It says, young man, arise, and he that was dead sat up and began to speak. But if you don't understand the Jewish protocol, you miss the whole story that really what this is saying is that Yeshua is the king of Israel, and they had to stop for him. Crazy, huh? Isn't this fun? So we'll look at this more next week.